biggest conversation is like we are in an extractive model of agriculture and we need to switch to a regenerative model of agriculture. And on a practical level, how do we do that? Like what does it take to go from one big model to another?
Well, I think that we need to have all of the players, and that's why having a conference such as this is really important because we have to have all of the players be a part of this throughout the entire supply chain. Farmers it can't just do this themselves. They need to have the support with um, the entire supply chain in order to be able to achieve this. Farmers have always wanted to be able to do the best for their soil, but we've also moved to a system that, as we initially started looking at what was best for the soil, we equated a lot of that with productivity. And as we have looked at different ways in which we can improve productivity, utilizing a lot of synthetic tools and adding to it, we've gone away from what is actually happening in the soil and the biology that's there. And so we need to be able to link that soil health with productivity and not just be looking at productivity as a whole, going back to that linkage. And so having that support across the supply chain is essential to be able to achieve that.
There is not one farmer that doesn't like actually its farm and its soil. It's just giving them the tool actually to do it in a different way. Um, Jamie, could you tell us quite quickly what is from regenerative agriculture to regenerative viticulture? What is regenerative viticulture? And maybe what's the definition that you chose for your book? Because there's so many.
Well, I think the key is the principles of regenerative farming is the science of agroecology. So what you're doing is you're creating an ecosystem where the ecosystem works and it functions well. So you're, for instance, bringing in biodiversity using this regenerative viticulture toolkit, which is lots of different intelligent, smart approaches that are locally applied, considering conditions because vineyards, you can't have a template for all vineyards. For instance, if you go to Yamanashi in Japan, where they have high growing season rainfall, it's very different from going to Central Otago to Nigel's Patch, where it's fairly arid during the summer. Your regenerative approach in different places like that would be completely different. So it's having this toolkit, applying it intelligently, and getting the ecosystem to work. They call it in the trade ecosystem services. So when you have an ecosystem that is functioning within your vineyard, you're using fewer inputs, and it's input reduction. But the funny thing is, we've got a name for it now, regenerative, but a lot of it's really just intelligent viticulture. And I think a lot of people have been doing it for a long time, but now there's a name for this. And it will look different in different places.
And why do we need a name for it now? Like, why? I mean, it's been such a buzzword. We've been hearing about it for the last 2 years. Is it just because we needed a new buzzword, or is there a reason why there's so much predominance about this? I'll ask you the same question. I know that I can see you shaking your head.
I think there's a real need for a banner to gather under. Like, I think organic has been very successful, and obviously in the wine world we've got a version of organics called biodynamic that is kind of peculiarly to the wine world has become very successful and popular. And those are banners that people have gathered under effectively, and it kind of helps people to, it's fairly clear that what someone is doing if they're farming organically or biodynamically. I think the problem with sustainability is that that word is effectively useless because it means so many different things in different places. It's been lost. I think sustainable is lost. But regenerative, I think, is a really useful term that I think as long as it's kept in the realm of science, which so far it has been, then I think it's going to be really important for organising how people think and how people work in vineyards. So I think it's a really powerful term.
So regenerative, if I sum it up, is about putting life back in the soil and making sure it continues and it creates virtuous circle as well.
Yes, but I'd say more than that. It's not just, we can't just focus on the soil. We think of the whole ecosystem of the vineyard, and that includes, because I think the problem with the previous, what we call conventional viticulture, is that it's not actually that scientific because it's only a very limited understanding of the scientific interactions that are taking place, a lot of them below ground in terms of growing crops. There's a lot of stuff happening that we just didn't know about before. And now we're aware of it. So I think it's the full scientific understanding of what's going on in that ecosystem
that allows it as well and explain the now too. So soils, of course, is a big concern. Water, as we all know it, has always been quite a concern, but has become an even bigger concern in viticulture as well. And I would like to ask you, all you, Hannah, Rosa, and Miguel, within your lifetime, how have you seen the water situation evolve in your respective country? I think we've got Spain, we've got California, we've got South Africa, representing people that do actually struggle with water. How has it changed, and what are the issues that you see arising in terms of water management? Do you want to start, Miguel, maybe? We should have to.
Well, in Spain and especially the Mediterranean climates that we have, really water is something very, very important. No, most of the vineyards are not irrigated, and it is true that in terms of amount of water that rains during the year, it is hard to establish a pattern to say that if it rains more or less. But what is clear is that it rains on a different way, right? It rains less days, but when it rains is really hard on that side. So what we are seeing more and more are a lot of problems of erosion, right? And then of course we can say that we have maybe the same or less water, but the problem is that as the temperature increases, this water evaporates much faster, no? So you see at the reservoirs of waters that we have in Spain, and for example now that is the summertime there, we started the summer and they are maybe at 30 or 40%, no? Though that applies onto the reservoirs on agriculture too. So it's a very important challenge, and on that side, I guess that we're going to talk about, but regenerative viticulture really brings solutions that are very interesting.
How is it here in South Africa?
We come from a time in South Africa in 2015 to 18 that we had day zero. We had no water. The IPCC report, the latest report, was interpreted for me. But before I carry on, I really feel quite stupid sitting here talking about regenerative farming with someone like Johan Reinecke in the audience that has been doing that very successfully for the last 20 years. But I will carry on. The IPCC report that was interpreted for me by Professor Stephanie Midgley, a fantastic scientist, climatologist at the Department of Agriculture, makes it quite clear. By 2050, in the Mediterranean climates, especially in southwestern Africa, slapdash where we are, we're going to be 3 degrees warmer on average than what we are now. They predict that they're not as precise in the prediction in terms of water as they are in terms of temperature. They predict that we're going to have up to 25% less water. If the water comes down, like you've mentioned, Mr. Torres, we're going to have floods. It's not going to be the old traditional soft Cape rain. It's going to come down in floods. We're going to have erosion. We're going to have more fires. And we're going to have, which is very scary to me, cycles of drought. So we're going to have 3 years in a row where there's no water. So what do we do about that? We know climate change is a threat. I think regenerative farming is a fantastic concept, but it's only one concept under water management. I think in South Africa, we have started devising ways, and Chris and Andrea Malini are sitting there smiling. We've done that on their farm. We've done it at a couple of farms now where we actually plan a vineyard. We design vineyards to capture and harvest every drop of water that falls onto that land, redirect it to a dam, and use your own water rather than pumping water 300 kilometers away from a big dam. As people are going to, we know that there's going to be something like 30% more people in the Western Cape and Cape Town in 10 or 20 years' time. I don't know the exact figure, but we know it's going to be, people are going to immigrate here, and we're going to know that the people are having many more babies. So the government is going to use the water for the people, not for agriculture. So we should have some kind of incentive for farmers, I think, to capture the water on their own land. South African farmers are not subsidized. It has a lot, I think incentives will have a lot to do with transformation, which is an issue we will not talk about today, but something that we need to discuss. there's in viticulture, there's many practical ways that we can be much more water wise. We've devised 16 points that we use in viticulture practically, like working with the contours, like the old people used to do. Like I was telling Mr. Torres, I went to Portugal and to Spain many years ago, and I saw in Cotriti as well, those beautiful contours. They're there for a purpose. They're not only there to look pretty, we're also doing the same at Jan Reineke's farm now. They're there to capture the water into a dam that you can use. But farmers don't have money to buy dams. So if you get money from the government maybe, and we can build dams, we can use much less water that's actually due for people and use much less energy through pumping electricity to get the water onto our farms if you irrigate your vineyards.
Hannah, what's the situation for you in California in regards to water?
Well, in California, drought is a part of our natural ecosystem, and it is cyclical. It has been a concern for generations. It's like wildfire, which is also a natural part of our ecosystem. What we're seeing now that is unanticipated is the change in intensity and duration. So from an agriculture perspective, and specifically within the wine industry, water is an issue that we have been working on and focused on for decades. And we have certainly made advances in terms of changes to our farming practices, changes to our approaches to protecting healthy soils. But one of the, I'd say, to address a new point that hasn't been as explored as much so far within this discussion is over the past 5 to 10 years have been changes in terms of state policy and approaches moving not away from, but in addition to individual choices that are made by farmers on a local basis, now the practices and policies are moving up to a more regionalized and even a statewide basis. So of course, as farmers, we can all relate to how much we enjoy being told what to do by others. And so this is not popular. But at the same time, it has been essential. And what we are seeing within California, there's actually a three-part way that they evaluate water. One part is what they call environmental water. That is water that is protected through our watersheds, our wild rivers. It's water that is readily available within the state, yet protected. There's water that is allocated for agriculture, and then the smallest percentage is water that's allocated for urban use. And the mix of how water is used up and down the state varies by region, depending on what drives the economy, the structure of that region, but also dependent upon the water that we have available during a season and really year to year. But that structure actually has provided us with some availability of water during those intense drought times. It has made it possible for us to continue ag and to continue to support our urban areas. As we're seeing climate evolve, we're seeing increasing stress put on that system, and that's what's becoming a concern. The response to that is that through many of these practices that we've been working for the past 2 to 3 decades to develop in terms of approaches to farming, crop selection, soil management, we've been able to extend the availability of water even during extreme drought times, but we're starting to see the deadline ahead of us, and that is what is scary for us. And so the positive side of this is the creativity in terms of some of the solutions and the approaches that our growers are bringing to us. And I was so happy to hear the comment right up front about regenerative farming being a system, because I think that one of the things, and when we start talking about some of the ideas that we're seeing within our regions, that I think is most interesting is taking the approach to water management within our wineries and our vineyards of a complete system. It isn't just one piece, but taking a systematic approach to the whole problem and using that as the jumping off point and then building from there. And I'm happy to share when we move on some examples that we're seeing.
Amazing. I just want to thank you. I just want to bring you Bruce in, and I'm sorry because I was really quick in your introduction, but Bruce and Bruce Langford and Stuart Orr, who's the gentleman who managed the freshwater for the WWF, they've just released a full white paper on regenerative agriculture and water. So if we don't have the time to explore the many facets, I would highly recommend to read that full paper. But Bruce, the first question that I had with you is for you, sorry. So we've heard a bit of the problems that viticulture can experience in different countries. Can I ask you to take a bird's eye view and tell us if what they're seeing is actually the same as what we see globally, and what's at stake with water at the moment?
Yes, I think that those three areas have just been described, California, the Mediterranean area, and the Cape, essentially are a representative of what's going on around the world in terms of where semi-arid, arid, and semi-humid catchments are being put under increasing stress and water demands from all sectors, including irrigation, including urban and domestic and industrial use, including environmental flows. So I think those three case studies essentially illuminate what's going on around the world. I mean, there are different cropping systems. For example, in Southeast Asia, it's more to do with rice, which of course is a key carbohydrate crop that feeds at least half the world's population. And as into this mix of growing world population, we have growing wealth. So we've got greater interest in out of season fruit and out of season vegetables being shipped around. As I said, carbohydrates need to be produced still from rice and maize. Sugarcane is a major irrigated crop. And we know what humans are like with sugar, so that's also a rising demand. So I think I'll leave it at that as a sort of global overview. The prognosis for the future is very worrying. I like all of the presentations just now which described the sort of tunnel or the cliff that's coming towards us, which is really scary climate change scenarios, really worrying droughts. And even if you're not in a drought, you've got rising temperatures during the off period, the winter period, when farmers are thinking about putting irrigation when they ordinarily wouldn't be doing that. So there's a combination of factors which are pretty scary.
If I understood well, also on your white paper, what the issues that agriculture is facing, and actually I think you've covered it all, is growing need for agriculture production and growing need for irrigated agricultural production, because we need more water to grow, reduction of share of water allocated to irrigation, and that's what you describe. We're going to use water for so many other things, and limited availability of water because we're already exceeding the natural renewal capacities. And that you describe, even when it rains, it evaporates because it's so warm. Sorry. Well, you see what I'm where I'm going. I've got a couple of questions before moving to the heart of the question about regenerative and water, because as you said, regenerative might be just one tool, but because we all really concerned about that topic of water, I wanted to ask you three, and Jamie as well, ask you four. What are the maybe some exciting examples of water management that you've seen in your country or globally that have to do with regenerative or not, that you think can be promising in water management in the next year? If you want to start, Miguel, as well.
Well, first, just to throw some data here, we have seen through different studies that really regenerative viticulture happens to hold a lot more water. No, when once you have a regenerated soil, and just to have a figure in mind, 1% of organic matter more in the soil, it's the equivalent of 250,000 liters per hectare. That, for example, in my wine region, where I get 500,000 milliliters. Well, this is a lot, no? This is like almost one third extra on that side, no? We also see how the erosion decreases a lot, no? Because, for example, when it rains very, very hard, you can see that during the past years we have lost a lot of soil, and it's very easy to see in the vineyard because you see the connection, the grafting between the American rootstock and the Vitis vinifera, how it's very far from the soil. Every centimeter that we lose because of erosion is more than 140 tons of the best soil that goes just to the river. No?
Terroir going away.
The terroir going away is our best soil. Regenerative viticulture, as you know, it promotes, it's essential to have a ground cover. I think that when you have ground cover, you can reduce up to 20 degrees the temperature of the soil compared if when you have a naked soil, no? And also, of course, as we're commenting, regenerative viticulture promotes also the fact that you start planting on the key line design, and this allows you a much better distribution of the water in your vineyard. No? So there are very positive things, and all these techniques, and they have been implemented. They are working in several parts of the world. So it's not something that you can just apply in a small vineyard on a certain way, because you have, the ground cover, the animals there. No, regenerative viticulture can be applied to any vineyard in the world. Absolutely.
Jamie, what are the most exciting example of water management that you've come across?
Well, I think there's a few. There's a lot. I mean, the last time I came to South Africa, I went to Randstone with Chris and Andrea, and also to Eben's new vineyards, and I'm seeing people doing intelligent things in terms of, what's the most sensible option for a Mediterranean-style climate. It's not to have a high VSP. It's to start, put bush vines in. But the problem there, and this is where we're facing lots of issues, is that across, I was in the Douro a couple of weeks ago, and one of the issues in the Douro is that labour is becoming very, very difficult to come by. And so the sorts of vineyards you want to put in require more labour, because they're the ones that are truly sustainable. You've got to hand pick them, you can't machine pick them. But if you want to mechanise a vineyard, you want the VSPs, you want the nice straight rows, but then the VSP in a warm climate is a disaster, in terms of water use efficiency. So I think it's about thinking about your place and what is the solution. And the solution sometimes requires it goes deeper than simply just what's the vineyard. What is the social element as well, in terms of regenerating the vineyard ecology? What about regenerating the rural areas where, you've got people who actually take agriculture as a serious career rather than very low paid, temporary work.
Punishment, like if you don't work at school, you're going to be a viticulturist.
And certainly in a lot of places in Europe, the limiting factor for doing the right thing in the vineyard is the availability of labour. So that's something that needs to be addressed if we're going to make more sustainable vineyards and sustainable communities in the areas where those vineyards are placed. And one very exciting example was I spent a lot of time in Marlborough a few years ago. And there's one guy there, Takaki Okada, his wine brand is Folium. And he... in Marlborough, the belief is that you have to irrigate. Takaki, when he got his vineyard in the Brancott Valley, he switched the taps off. And he said it was a crazy thing to do, but it worked. And now he's got a dry-grown vineyard in Marlborough. And in Marlborough, what you're seeing is a lot of the farmers, they're going for yield. They're not thinking very carefully about water use. So what they do is they irrigate lots early in the season before the irrigation rights are lost because the dams are too low. And so they grow big canopies fast that then require more irrigation and more water to maintain. So it's a way of thinking, I think. It's like a way of farming, and there are smart ways. And Takaki, I think, is a risk taker, but he's proved that he can do that. He can dry grow. And at Clos Henri, they do that. He was working there before. They dry grow as well, in a region where you're not supposed to be able to dry grow.
Hannah?
One working? Ah, there it is. So many examples of some interesting things. Of interesting things that are being put in place in California, and I think one of the things that's well, that's good. I got the uninteresting part out of the way when you couldn't hear it. There are a number of different approaches that are being implemented by growers, both large and small, in California. But I think one of the most significant approaches, and sort of the by no means uniquely Californian, but just a part of the way that we tend to approach things, is really from a holistic perspective. Just as you were referencing, and that, of course, the agriculture piece, the viticulture, is essential, but it also has to work hand in hand with the winery, and then even just as importantly, with the team that's working in the vineyards and in the winery. And so there are sort of three key examples that I particularly like that illustrate the nature what I see as solutions that will work for us, that made up of a combination of both small ideas but also large ideas, ranging from the technology of systems to using squeegees in the winery. And the first is that Jackson Family Wines has actually taken a whole approach that truly is a systematic way of thinking about their water, and that it's made up of 4 key pieces. The first is mapping, then managing, tracking, and then reuse and recycling. And the point is to start by understanding where the hot spots are within the winery and the vineyard in terms of water use, understanding why those are the hot spots and what drives that. Then build a system to manage those hot spots. Don't address the whole problem at once, but start with the worst parts, build a new system to address that problem, and then work your way through. But then, because you can't manage what you don't measure, have tracking systems in place. We're familiar, of course, with sensors in the vineyards and soil sensors, but taking that sensor approach and that tracking approach to all aspects and all those hotspots of water use in the vineyard and the winery, and then based on that, focus on reuse and recycle and how to repurpose the water so that you're using it more than once throughout the whole process, and looking at the system from vineyard to bottle as a complete system and holistically. Another example is within Silver Oak, and at this point sort of a combination of both tech and people. So of course looking to find ways to involve technology and building systems to increase their efficiency of water throughout their whole process. But on top of that, layering on a culture and behavior for their entire team that puts water conservation and water reuse at the top of the way that they approach their jobs, regardless of where they are, whether they're in the vineyard, the winery, the tasting room, all the way through. And so I think that is the humanistic aspect, which is important. And the third example is really driven from nature. And Ted Lemon at Literati and also Jason Haas at Tablas Creek have both built water reuse processes. They've constructed wetlands on their properties that naturally filter water from the production process so that then it becomes purified using the plants and the bacteria within the root systems of those plants in order to purify that water and make it usable for ag irrigation again, and continuing to run their water through that cycle, and that's dramatically reduced their water usage. And so that whole approach, starting from the high tech to essentially the low tech, and integrating people, place, and technology to think holistically about how to improve water, that's where I think we as an industry can be working together and sharing those kinds of ideas and techniques.
And I've got a burning question for Chris at this stage, because we had so many examples that associated regenerative viticulture with dry farming. Chris, can we do regenerative and irrigation, or how do those two concepts fit? Do you have to be, if you want to be regenerative, do you have to be dry farming? Like how can we reconcile both?
Well, I think that it is important for us to be looking, again, as everyone said, across multiple types of sectors and the way that we're evaluating it. At my land, when we're looking, we're primarily within irrigated agriculture because we're applying microalgae through the irrigation system. But what we're trying to do is actually reduce the amount of irrigation that's going to be needed. So reducing either the frequency or the time of irrigation, or both, by utilizing the microbial community to help to create various types of, again, soil structure that's going to have more porosity, as well as creating various types of biofilms that can help to keep water near the root zone and being able to help to maintain how productive that system is going to be in its water use and water use efficiencies. A lot of the other speakers have addressed the ideas of what we could look at above ground, utilizing cover crops or living mulches, plant material irrigating at different times, worked with producers that are irrigating more of that mulch crop, and that helping to improve the water use efficiency that may be happening within the vineyard itself as far as for the vines, as well as how we're going to be looking again at this whole entire system. So when we're talking about irrigated agriculture, I think that we really do need to address the fact that irrigated agriculture doesn't mean that we are reducing water use efficiencies or that we're utilizing too much water, but it actually is figuring out how we can efficiently utilize the water at the right time in the right place with the right plant material and the right microbial community to really help to hold that water in the root zone.
Can you just quickly tell us what the microalgae is doing and how that can help with water management?
So, what the microalgae will be doing are a number of different things. They actually will work with consortia of other microbes where they can help to aggregate soil together to create um, basically balls of soil and organic matter, sand, silt, and clay, microbial communities in these aggregates or pellets that are in the soil, and between those pellets, you're going to have that open space. And that open space, that porosity, is going to allow for the water to flow into the soil very quickly. But again, more importantly, for the water to be held in that pore space. I think of this sometimes as creating a plumbing system in which instead of going from large pipe to small pipe, you have all these different diameters in that pore space because of the different sizes of aggregates that are going to be created. And when you do that by changing diameters of the pipe, it actually allows for water to be held or water to rest in a certain area at the bottom of a pipe that may be much larger when it's going into a pipe that's much smaller. So you aren't really losing as much water to evaporation, nor to water by gravity pulling the water out of the profile. So that's one thing that the microalgae can do as far as the soil structure and physical relationships are concerned. Again, the other thing the microalgae can do is really working with helping to create biofilms and helping to create a system in which not just you're looking at water, but you're also looking at nutrient efficiencies so that you can obtain more nutrients and cycle more nutrients more efficiently in the soil profile, which is oftentimes a way in which the plant is ending up kind of wasting water in the effort to try and get nutrients from the soil instead of those nutrients being delivered via the microbial community to the roots or at least within the rhizosphere, so that you don't have to create mass flow by having a lot of water in the rhizosphere to get nutrients to flow to the rhizosphere. Instead, you're creating an environment in that rhizosphere where those nutrients are going to be constantly cycled around the roots, and you don't have to get mass flow to get nutrients from further away to flow towards those roots. So we want
The
to
system of
improve these
making it
efficiencies at
available and
multiple
making it
levels.
more efficient. Could I have got Bruce back? Thanks so much, Chris. So as I was saying, Bruce, you actually wrote a full paper to answer that question: how can regenerative agriculture, help with water management? And it's not that you do not believe in the system; is you were quite critical about how it could work. I mean, we only have maybe 5 minutes late, but in that 5 minutes, can you explain to us what's the relationship between, do you need regenerative agriculture to have a good water management, or do you need a good water management to have regenerative agriculture? And you talk a lot about idealized goals of regen when it comes to water, and what would it take for those goals to not be idealized, but I mean to be real success in terms of water management for the soil?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just concentrate on one sort of unforeseen consequence or a paradoxical outcome. So I completely understand how regenerative agriculture alongside, say, precision irrigation, would enable you to use less water at the field scale. And so you would apply less water because you're using drip irrigation, and also because your soil is regenerated and has better infiltration and better water holding capacity, you would then trap more rainwater. So ideally at the field scale, just at the orchard or at the particular field, you would use less water. But a paradoxical outcome is that that efficiency is then banked by the farmer, and especially not during the drought when they're trying to conserve water tremendously, but in the period between droughts, the farmer can then expand his or her farm area. So in a sense, they're using those efficiency gains to increase their orchard area or their vineyard area. And then what happens then is that the next drought comes along and they've sort of ratcheted up the risks by increasing their irrigated area, the vineyard area or the orchard area. And they've sort of banked the efficiency gains, and it's then a question of what during the next drought, what do they have to draw upon in terms of yet more efficiency gains. And I think this has been alluded to, which is that you can only go so far with, very healthy soil or very precision agriculture. And the real issue is how are you regulating ultimately your own net demand for water, which is a combination of things like your efficiency and your net irrigated area. And then farmers, given that dialogue, given that those possible scenarios, can then decide, well, let's not increase irrigated area in the next 10 years with every efficiency gain or every soil gain. Let's keep water in groundwater or keep water in dams, micro dams, farm dams, or seasonal dams. And then they have a choice as to how they're going to get through the next drought, rather than just simply chasing efficiency gains and then and regenerative soils for the purpose of, it's two purposes. It's seeing through a drought and then what you do between the droughts in terms of being ready for the next drought. I'm not sure if I've made myself very clear, but that's the paradox of efficiency gain, which is that you end up using more water. And you run
Wasn't that a part of your paper that also said the paradox is also when you want to turn like a conventional farming into regenerative farming, the amount of water that you would need to put in the ground to actually have enough moisture that it can continue is actually quite a lot and too much in certain area. Did I understand correctly?
Well, that's one particular argument. I mean, that hasn't really cropped up as far as I can see this afternoon, which is that there are people who believe that you can regenerate soil not through practices that have been discussed this afternoon, which are simply to do with better organic matter management, contour farming, resting the soil, intercropping, and so on and so forth. But there are people who believe that you should be keeping the soil more moist in order to raise microbiological activity and biological activity, worms and beetles and so on and so forth. And that is a real worry, because what you're asking farmers to do is not only irrigate to meet the needs of the crop, but you're asking them to meet this sort of unstated need to keep the soil, even between individual plants, to asking them to keep the soil, their field, wetter for longer, and in a sense, a greater cross section of the field is kept more moist in order to try and bring organic matter and bring plant density up and root density up. And that's what we point to in terms of, well, that will put an enormous pressure on farming systems and on catchments and on water allocation for other sectors. If you're somehow asking farmers to keep soils more moist in order to regenerate.
And what I liked in your paper as well is you said, well, regenerative agriculture sometimes focus a lot on carbon capture, and water is the missing element. We need also to think about water. But in everything that you've said, it's exactly, well, let's start with water and build a system that works. I think I've asked you 5 of the question about the hundreds that I had for you, but I really want to open it to the audience, and either if you want to share an irrigation, not a water management technique that you are doing that you think is successful, if you want to ask any questions to the panel, the floor is yours. Can we have someone for?
I think Dudley and I, we have been discussing this for so long now, and I think the big problem with regenerative farming is in our regenerative agriculture is really, and that's not my sort of like original thought, but it's about the mindset. And the biggest problem is the mindset. And I think it doesn't start with water. I think actually, all the new studies and people that are extremely successful and extremely profitable in terms of regenerative farming, they are talking about plants and photosynthesis, and then this liquid carbon cycle. And this is much more important than trying to reestablish like a thin layer of soil by adding more. So it's a change that has to happen in the minds of all of us on how we farm. And I think that the most important, like we sort of like, okay, we all understand what regenerative farming is, but I think there is a lot of different understandings of what it is. Like I think regenerative farm is about multi-species, and if you don't have that, like the cover of the soil is the first step. Like try to reestablish what that soil was, if it's already sort of like almost dead, is a second step. But if you don't have this cover crop and everything else that comes from that, you don't have regenerative farming. Like, how can we be producing wine? And I think Dudley wrote this beautiful blog recently. How do we have the right to produce wine? That's actually the question. If we are not producing enough food for the world. So what's our right to have our vines, and if you're not managing this in a much more efficient way than people that are producing food? And there are amazing examples. I think that we can talk more about that, and I wish if you can talk a little bit about that. In our United States, that people producing food, producing grains, and they are not using any input. They are capturing all the nitrogen from the air. They are, not irrigating anything, and they are having amazing results that we should be like chasing them like crazy and learning from them and applying this into viticulture.
To build on that, Miguel, with everything that you do and you've implemented with a regenerative approach in your farm, have you set up any kind of like quantitative objective in the reduce of water? Like, what's the hope? And like, if you had a magic wand, what would you achieve in terms of water management on your farms?
Well, our objective, is that at the end, all our vineyards of our property, they have to be run under regenerative viticulture. We started on a vineyard that is the vineyard close to our home, Mazda Plana, because you have to be there to check what is going on, no, and to implement all the techniques and to understand it better. But now we're already at 400 hectares and increasing. No, we want to reach 1,700 hectares, and also we are for the first time we are telling our vine growers, our suppliers, families that have been working with us, that aside of organic grapes, we want to have more regenerative grapes. No, and that of course is a change on that side. No.
And so bringing the whole, again, taking that systemic approach and bringing the people a step before, a step after in the supply, in the value chain, I'm going to say.
Well, is that I think that the people is I think that it was common here is very important. The first change is in ourselves, how we understand how we produce food, or how we produce grapes to make wine, no? Because we are in an industry, in a sector that we are very traditional in many ways, you know. My father was doing almost exactly the same thing as my grandfather, no? Yes, he planted some Cabernet, but the rest was Garnacha, Cariñena, no? Always planted, planting the same varieties, tilting the soil almost the same days, no? Harvesting almost the same day because it was the major party of the town. So there are certain traditions that have been kept, but for a long time we haven't asked ourselves why, you know, why are we doing this way, no? And of course, you know, I cannot blame my father or my grandfather because they did not know anything about climate change, no? We are maybe the first generation that have to ask ourselves these questions and have to ask what are we going to plan, how are we going to do it to continue making grapes, especially in a family company. You think that, you know, you would like your children one day to continue, no? How are we going to manage the water, no? And for that, at least ourselves, but I know many other people around the world, that we have taken the decision that we cannot continue with soils with 1% of organic matter that are clearly desertified almost, no? In Spain, we always say, if you have a great soil, plant tomatoes. If you don't have such a good soil, then you plant fruit trees. And then at the very end, when the soil is very bad, then you have to plant vines, no? So I don't want that to continue, and that's why it's a commitment, but we have decided to go full on regenerative viticulture.
And Rosa, as a maybe my last question, Miguel talked about old and ancient history and tradition. What can we learn from old vines in terms of water management, and does that link into the regenerative, or like actually the change of mindset that Irina and Miguel have been talking about?
It links beautifully into that. We know that there's 9 vineyards in South Africa older than 120 years. We also know that they were planted on old riverbeds, so there was water somewhere. We all know that they planted presently and have always been dry land. So they've been surviving for 120 years, dry land, and still producing today a crop. Andrea Molyneux is making a sensor from a vineyard like that. But what can we learn from that? They seem to be self-regulating. Vineyards, old vineyards, if it's a dry season, they produce less. They seem to have, and this sounds romantic, but it's true, they seem to have a memory. So if it's a dry season, the next season they produce less. If it was more water, there's more water in the next season, they produce more. They seem, according to studies done by Professor Archer and David Simon, there's 50%, and Evan Sadi did the sum for me. Old vines have 50% more roots, not deeper roots, just more roots and denser roots than younger vines. What do we learn from that? Regenerative farming and soil health is crucial because that adds to more roots. So if we have more roots, we will have a better, and what we found lately with old vines is the season might be harsh. The acidities might drop much more in younger vines, in the grapes, than in older vines, but the pH holds better. And isn't that what is crucial for wine? So those vineyards were planted pre-industrial, pre-mechanization times, when there was a biodiverse system around them. There was apricots, there were cattle, there were sheep, there were ducks, and there was a holistic approach. Smaller, Jamie, could you completely correct? Smaller vines, less nitrogen-rich vines, smaller canopies, in a warm climate, more bush vines. Most of the old vines that we have in South Africa are bush vines, so we can actually learn a hell of a lot from old vines.
Any burning question? Yes.
Thank you. We're in Africa, and we like to talk about the big five when you come and visit us. And I think there's another big five, which is perhaps not as awesome. If you look at the big five in terms of contributing factors to global warming and greenhouse gases, agriculture is one of them. And fortunately, by the same logic, it can be one of the 5 most effective solutions we can use to slow it down or to reverse it. And that to me is a very important motivating factor for practicing regenerative agriculture. I think it's absolutely essential. We have to ask ourselves if we want to get up and make the world a better place through our work and how we farm, or not. But recently, I've spent a lot of years focusing on farming and sort of thinking that's the way forward, but I came across other interesting factors as well. One of them was Professor Guy Mitchley. Rosa, you mentioned him already. He said to me the other day that there's so much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that for every ton that we sequestrate, we're effectively only sequestrating 500 kilograms, because all the excess is being forced into the oceans. And as soon as we remove a ton of CO2 out of the atmosphere, at least 500 kgs goes back from the sea into the atmosphere. So the lowest hanging fruit for us as farmers to pick is not necessarily just trying to sequestrate carbon, but stop emitting it. So the use of solar panels, things like that, for example, become absolutely crucial. Other things that I also read recently is that it was a study done in California. I don't think one should generalize because regions differ and farms and wineries differ. But what came out of that was the carbon footprint of the average wine farm. About 17% of that can go back or be traced back to vineyard practices, and 29% needs to be allocated to things like bottle weights. Another thing that I read recently is that if you take a plane and you fly from London to New York, that's got the same carbon footprint as 3 pallets of wine. That includes all the agriculture, the glass, everything that went into it. So it's actually quite hard, because if you look at us, all of us in this room, the fact is that for everybody on this planet to live the way we live, we would need at least 1.5 planets to sustain our lifestyles. So I think, although regenerative agriculture is absolutely crucial, we cannot see it in isolation. And I think all of us in this industry, whether we grow grapes or whether we make wine or whether we write about the stuff or fly around the world, we're all in this. And we have to ask ourselves, how can we change and try and get up every day and make the world a better place rather than contribute to this damage. I don't want to leave it on a negative note, though.
I see it as a very positive note. Like, we can do something. Like, there's it's the glass half full or the glass half empty. But actually, Elizabeth, Chris' colleague at Myland, she was saying, well, we can also see climate change as a positive thing. We've got all that carbon in the atmosphere, and soil needs carbon, so it's a big opportunity, to actually match both. So thank you very much, Johan, for that summarizing. Thanks, Irina, also for your point. Thank you, Jamie, Hannah, Rosa, Miguel, Bruce, and Chris for being with us. And I'm sure we're going to continue that conversation and for many years, because it's a crucial one. And for the last panel of the day, we actually don't have a panel. We've got a debate, like an old school Oxbridge debate with 2 teams fighting each other about the notion of luxury, and do we actually still need luxury in the world today? So thank you very much. I'm going to call Mike, Felicity, Julia, Anthony, and Nicole to the stage. Thank you very much. Thank you.